all know the story. 300 Spartans at a narrow pass, defiant to the last man. It's the ultimate story of a heroic last stand. We also know the sequel. A year later, at the Battle of Plataea, a unified Greek army led by 10,000 Spartan hoplites got their revenge, smashing the Persian invasion force and avenging their fallen king. It's a perfect story of sacrifice and vindication. But today, we're not in ancient Greece. The year is not 479 BC. The year is 1192 AD, and the battlefield is a strip of sun-scorched sand on the coast of the Holy Land. The Spartans are not Greeks, but a handful of exhausted, fever-ridden crusader knights. Their Leonidas is a red-cloaked English king, and their Plataea is not a massive, set-piece battle of 100,000 men. It's a desperate, insane, and almost suicidal gamble by less than 3,000 men against the most powerful army on earth. This is the story of the Battle of Jaffa, a battle that should have been an execution, but instead became one of the most stunning reversals in military history. This is the story of how Richard the Lionheart had his own Thermopylae and his own Plataea in the span of just 3 days. To understand the desperation of Jaffa, you have to understand the failure of the Third Crusade. For years, King Richard I of England, the Lionheart, had waged a bloody war to reclaim Jerusalem from the legendary Sultan Saladin. He had won stunning victories at Acre and Arsuf, proving himself the greatest battlefield commander of his age. But he had failed. Jerusalem, the entire point of the crusade, remained in Saladin's hands. The Crusader army was shattered, not by defeat, but by politics, disease, and exhaustion. Richard himself was sick with a fever, his body breaking down. His allies had abandoned him. His own brother, John, was trying to steal his throne back in England. The war was over. In the summer of 1192, a truce was finally being brokered. Richard, his spirit broken, had agreed to terms. He would keep a thin strip of coastal cities, and, in return, Saladin would guarantee safe passage for unarmed Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Richard gathered his fleet at the port of Acre, preparing to sail for home. A failure in his own eyes. He had packed his bags. His ship was ready. He was leaving the Holy Land forever. But Saladin, the master strategist, saw one last opportunity. Jaffa was the strategic port closest to Jerusalem. If Saladin held Jaffa, the Crusader kingdom would be stringlet, and the pilgrimage route would be a dead letter. Seeing Richard's fleet preparing to leave, Saladin decided to slam the door shut. He broke the truce and marched on Jaffa with a massive Ayyubid army, numbered in the tens of thousands. The city was lightly held, its walls damaged from previous engagements. The small garrison of a few thousand men under Alberic of Rheims was stunned by the speed and size of Saladin's assault. Siege engines pounded the walls, and on July 30th, the walls were breached. Saladin's soldiers poured into the city, and a brutal massacre began. The garrison, seeing all was lost, fled to the city's ancient citadel, the last point of defense. They were hopelessly trapped. Saladin, always pragmatic, offered them terms: surrender, and their lives would be spared. The garrison, with no hope of rescue, agreed. They were preparing to march out as prisoners, their crusade over, when a single, observant priest looked out to the sea. At first, he must have thought it was a mirage, but then he saw the sigil, a red cross on a white field. Then another, and another. An entire fleet was bearing down on the shore. The king had returned. What happened next is the stuff of legend. A messenger, some say a priest who swam from the citadel, had reached Richard's fleet just as it was setting sail from Acre. He told the king that Jaffa had fallen and the citadel was moments from surrender. Richard's advisors, his barons and generals, told him it was too late. The city was lost. To try and retake it now, with the handful of men they had on the ships, was suicide. They urged him to sail for home as planned. But this was more than a strategic loss for Richard. It was a personal insult. Saladin had broken his word. Richard, the man who lived for battle, exploded in a righteous fury. According to the chroniclers, he stood on the deck of his ship and roared, "As God lives, I will go to their aid." He didn't send a subordinate. He didn't wait to gather an army. He led his fleet, carrying perhaps only 50 to 60 knights and around 2,000 Genoese and Pisan crossbowmen, turned south and raced the clock. When they arrived at Jaffa on August 1st, the scene was dire. Saladin's Ayyubid army, thousands strong, had already taken the city and was busy sacking it. The beach was swarming with Saracen soldiers, jeering at the citadel's defenders. They never expected an attack from the sea. Richard's flagship, the Thermopylae, didn't even bother with a proper landing. The king ran it aground on the sand. What followed was Richard's Spartan moment. Clad in a crimson surcoat and wielding a massive Danish battle axe, the Lionheart leaped from the bow of his ship directly into the chest-deep surf. He wasn't the first man into the water, he was the man. His personal retinue of knights, his Spartans, followed him without hesitation. They hit the beach, not as an organized army, but as a wave of pure, concentrated fury. The Ayyubid soldiers on the shore, stunned by the sight of the King of England himself, charging them from the ocean, panicked. They had heard the legends of this Red Devil King, and now he was here, looking more like a demon than a man. The Genoese crossbowmen followed, establishing a deadly beachhead. They were the finest missile troops in the world, and their heavy bolts punched through Saracen armor with terrifying ease. Richard and his knights formed a steel-tipped spearhead, carving a path straight off the beach and toward the city gates. The defenders in the citadel, hearing the king's war cry, were electrified, their surrender forgotten. They threw open the gates and sallied forth, crashing into the Ayyubid army from the rear. Saladin's forces, who just moments before had been victorious, were now trapped between the king and the citadel. They were disorganized, confused, and terrified. They broke. In one of the most shocking reversals of the entire crusade, Richard's tiny amphibious force drove Saladin's massive army completely out of the city. By evening, Jaffa was back in Christian hands. Saladin, utterly humiliated by a king who had jumped out of a boat, retreated to regroup, seething with anger.
Faster, men! Plant those stakes! They're almost upon us!
Richard had won the first battle, but he knew the war for Jaffa was not over. The city walls were rubble. They couldn't be defended. Saladin's army was still intact, camped just a few miles away, and it still outnumbered Richard's force by at least 10 to 1. Any sane commander would have used the cover of night to repair the walls or, more likely, evacuate by sea. Richard did neither. In a move of almost suicidal audacity, he ordered his men to make camp outside the city walls on the open plain between Jaffa and Saladin's army. He had with him, at this point, perhaps 55 knights, many of whom had lost their horses in the campaign, and around 2,000 infantry, mostly crossbowmen. He was daring Saladin to attack him on open ground. It was an open invitation, a gauntlet thrown down. He was, in effect, creating his own hot gates. His men were exhausted, sick, and hopelessly outnumbered. All night, they worked, not to build a fortress, but to create a simple, desperate defense. They hammered their tent pegs deep into the ground and strung ropes between them to trip the cavalry. They sharpened long stakes and planted them in the sand, angled toward the enemy. They were preparing for an execution. When dawn broke on August 5th, the Crusaders saw what they feared. The entire Ayyubid army was advancing. It wasn't a probe, it was the final assault. Saladin had gathered his elite Mamluk heavy cavalry, thousands of the best horsemen in the world, to personally crush this impudent little band of Christians. The ground began to tremble. The horizon filled with the dust of 10,000 horses. This was it. This was Thermopylae. But Richard was not just a warrior. He was a tactical genius. He knew he could not outfight the Mamluks. He had to outthink them. He organized his tiny army with brilliant precision. He created a hedgehog formation, a spear wall worthy of Sparta itself. He ordered his infantry, the spearmen, to form a tight semicircle, their backs to the sea. They were to kneel, dig the butts of their spears into the sand, and present an unbroken wall of steel points. In the gaps between the spearmen, he placed his precious crossbowman, 2 to a man, 1 to fire, 1 to reload. This created a kill zone. Any horse that wasn't impaled by the spears would be struck by a crossbow bolt. And his knights, the heroes of the charge. He ordered them off their horses. This was unheard of. A knight's power was his horse, but Richard knew his handful of cavalry would be swallowed whole. Instead, he placed his 50-odd knights on foot directly behind the spear wall, a heavy armored reserve to plug any gap, to lend their courage and their steel to the infantry line. He gave them one simple order: hold the line, do not break, do not chase. Let them come to you. And then, Richard, on his own warhorse, rode up and down the line, not in the back, but in the most exposed position, shouting encouragement, his axe in hand. Then, the Mamluks charged. The sound was a deafening thunder. The first wave, thousands strong, crashed against the Christian line and stopped. The horses, brilliantly trained, would not impale themselves on the wall of spears. As they reared back in confusion, the Genoese crossbowmen unleashed a devastating volley at point-blank range. Bolts tore through chainmail and leather. Men and horses screamed and fell, creating a gruesome barrier in front of the Christian line. The Mamluks retreated, regrouped, and charged again, and again, and again. For hours, this brutal pattern repeated. Saladin threw wave after wave of his elite cavalry at the tiny hedgehog. Each time, the spear wall held. Each time, the crossbows reaped a bloody harvest. The ground was slick with blood. The Crusaders were exhausted, their arms burning, but they did not break. Richard was everywhere, a whirlwind of red and steel, fighting where the line was thinnest, his voice hoarse from roaring. Then came the moment that sealed the legend. Richard's own horse was killed from under him, and the king was forced to fight on foot alongside his men. Saladin, watching from a nearby hill, was stunned. He was witnessing an army that refused to die, led by a king who refused to yield. Saladin's own brother, Saladin, was so moved by the display of pure courage that he committed one of the most famous acts of chivalry in history. He sent a groom through the battlefield, under a flag of truce, with two fresh, magnificent Arab stallions as a gift for Richard. The message was clear. A king of your stature should not be fighting on foot. Richard, in the middle of this desperate battle for survival, accepted the gift, mounted one of the horses, and reportedly led a countercharge straight into the enemy. This final, insane act of defiance was too much. The Mamluks, having failed to break the line, and now seeing this seemingly invincible king charge them, finally broke and fled the field. Saladin, in disbelief, had been defeated. The Battle of Jaffa was over. Saladin's army, though still vast, was demoralized. He had thrown his best troops at a tiny, exhausted, and exposed force, and he had lost. It was a humiliation from which he could not recover. Richard's 3,000 Spartans had held the pass. But this was not a tragic defeat like Thermopylae. This was a stunning victory. This was Plataea. This victory, won by so few against so many, achieved what months of campaigning could not. Richard, now desperately ill from his fever and the exertion, had won the moral high ground. Saladin, a man who respected strength and honor above all else, knew he could not dislodge this lion. With mutual respect, the two great rivals finally signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The terms were almost exactly what Richard had wanted. The Crusader kingdom would hold the coastline from Acre to Jaffa. The walls of Ascalon would be demolished. But most importantly, the treaty guaranteed that unarmed Christian pilgrims would have free and safe access to Jerusalem to worship at the Holy Sepulchre. Richard had not conquered the Holy City, but he had opened it. He had achieved the spiritual goal of the Third Crusade, not through a bloody siege, but through one impossible, heroic battle. He had defended his beachhead, stood his ground, and earned his revenge by forcing the hand of his enemy. Richard the Lionheart sailed for home a few weeks later, never to return. He would be shipwrecked, imprisoned, and spend the rest of his short life fighting in France. But his legend was not forged in England or France. It was forged on the hot, bloody sands of Jaffa. The Battle of Jaffa is often overlooked, a final footnote to a long and bloody crusade. But it is, perhaps, Richard's single greatest moment. It was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and unbelievable audacity. It proved that a few determined warriors, led by a king who would willingly fight on foot beside them, could defy an empire. It wasn't 10,000 Spartans at Plataea who won the day. It was 50 knights and 2,000 infantrymen standing back to back who showed the world that the will to fight can be stronger than any army. They didn't just avenge a defeat. They snatched an impossible victory from the jaws of total annihilation. What do you think? Was the Battle of Jaffa the most impressive last-stand victory in history? Or was it Richard's chivalrous rival, Saladin, who showed his true greatness by honoring his foe? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the most brutal, unbelievable, and legendary battles in history, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode.